Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Webster. I'm the founder, CEO, and CISO for Cyvergence. Today, we're going to cover an introduction to identity governance, part one. So what are you going to learn today? We're going to cover why identity governance is so important. We're defining identity governance. We're going to take a look at some of the basic identity processes and take a look at how technology relates to identity. So the sections we're going to cover are defining identity governance, technology context, and Cyvergence services. So a bit of housekeeping. This is part one of an ongoing series. When I originally created it, it was close to 2 hours long, and I decided that's just too long for a presentation. So it's not intended to cover everything. As we go through the various sections later on, we'll get to some of the other topics in identity governance because there really is so much to cover today. Also keep in mind that although we use high quality sources of information, there may be contradictory information in the market space, or maybe you might find some things that are contradictory within the information, and that's normal because what you're going to find is there's different ways of presenting that information, and sometimes that information does collide with one another. Just keep that into account. I try to pick out really good sources that are best for you. So let's go ahead and define identity governance, but before we do that, we're going to start with why is identity governance so important? So below, we're finding identity-based breach information. The sources that I'm pulling from today are Palo Alto Networks Unit 42 and the 2023 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. So if we take a look at the types of data that are compromised in a random breach, roughly 50% of it involved compromising credentials. This means that the hackers are stealing the credentials when they breach or compromise an organization. It's not always about the data. And the reason why they do this is because they use that data to go after other sources. So for example, on the dark web, what you're going to find is they will pull one site and then they will reuse those same passwords someplace else. And people tend to do that as well. This is why we constantly force those password changes in many of the organizations. It's because people have a tendency of reusing passwords over and over and over again. For when you're looking at web applications, what do the hackers typically go for? 86% of the time, they're going to go after the credentials. And again, because if somebody's using that credential in one place, they're going to use it in another and another and another. So it is very common to see identity-based information stolen by hackers. Now, if you look at the action varieties, now this is what typically happens or how was a system compromised. From an identity perspective, for a general breach, over 40% of breaches involve the use of stolen credentials because they're harvesting those passwords and then they're testing them to see if they can use that to get into somebody. So when you consider something like LinkedIn, which is a fantastic resource, they could say, oh, well, I found so-and-so's credential here on the dark web. Oh, I see they're working over at said company. Let's go ahead and try that password elsewhere. So it's really common to see them used. But when you consider the web application attacks, 80% of those web application attacks involve the use of stolen credentials. That's how they're able to gain access to a website. So you can be very targeted with this information. So the more information you can pull on somebody, the more likely you are to be able to compromise them because people are creatures of habit and tend, with exceptions, to do the same thing over and over and over again. Now, when you talk about the generally suspected initial access, so this is not throughout the entire breach lifecycle and what a hacker is going to do within it, but when you're looking at the initial access vector for a breach, you're going to find something called brute force. So a brute force is an attack where they try to do that hacking again and again and again with different passwords over and over and over again until they get through that organization. So a brute force attack is roughly in the 9% range. Now, a lot of times they use previously compromised credentials. This is 8%, and this data is coming in from Palo Alto. And when you look at trusted tools, tools that are already in the organization that may be used by another third party for something, that's roughly 4% of those attacks. When you look at insiders, that's somebody who's currently existing within the organization. They're being used in various ways to provide that initial access. Now, it could be that they're cognizant, which does happen upon occasion, but it could be they're completely oblivious to the fact that they caused an issue. But insiders are part of that breach process in roughly 5% of breaches for suspected initial access. Now, ransomware is a different story. When you're talking about brute forcing, you're up to 20% of the time, they're going to use brute force credentials. They're going to keep attacking it with this password over and over and over again until they're able to get in. When you look at previously compromised credentials, it's the same. You're looking at 8%, and the abuse to trusted relationship of tools, you're looking at 8%. So it's a little bit higher when you're talking about those tools related to ransomware. And this is because what's happening is a lot of those third parties that are compromised are compromises that are of tools that companies use, and those are being targeted by a lot of the hackers that are out there. So when you talk about that supply chain attack, that's one of the mechanisms that hackers are using today, especially if they're interested in something like ransomware. So in general, this is why paying attention to identity within your organization is so important. And there's a lot of controls that we're going to touch on in a later series. But let's go ahead and define identity governance. So this I grabbed from SailPoint. I looked around at several of the definitions that are on the internet to try to come up with something, but I thought this was a decent definition of identity governance. So identity governance and administration, also known as identity security, is at the center of IT operations, enabling and securing digital identities for all users, applications, and data. It allows businesses to provide automated access to an ever-growing number of technology assets while managing potential security and compliance risks. And so we're going to go into a lot of the details why this is true. But you see here, this is also very much the main process that we're talking about is IT operations. But as we start to go a little bit deeper, we're going to see where security might possibly fit into this overarching relationship to what's going on within an organization. So this is a general identity lifecycle. Don't think that this is true throughout all organizations. There are other processes that I'm not including here that could be included as part of your identity process. But this, generally speaking, is how a reasonably healthy organization is going to run. I know there's some of you who may disagree with it because there's more you can start to add into it, but this is part of that overarching process. But generally, the first step that you're going to find is somebody needs to authorize the account. So let's say you're hiring a new employee. It's going to be approved by human resources, or it's going to be approved by the hiring manager. It just depends on the context in this case, in order to create a generic account. And again, processes may vary. And then somebody goes through and provisions that account. That's usually the IT operations team, somebody who's handling things from an administrative standpoint on that front. But then you have ongoing management. Let's say somebody moves from one part of the organization to another part of an organization. You need to manage that process. That's part of what goes on. Or maybe their password expires, or they were out for a little bit, or all kinds of things can go on from a management standpoint. But that's part of that managing process. Another thing, and this is usually where security comes in, but sometimes this is handled within directly the IT operations team. It just depends on the context, is you get somebody to come in and assess whether or not somebody's authorized. Like, for example, there is a provisioning and deprovisioning process. And sometimes when somebody, let's say, leaves an organization, that account may still be active. And we'll start to talk about that later. But what you should do in a healthy organization is assess whether or not it's an authorized account or not. If it's not authorized, then you start to handle that and try to figure out what the issues are. So once that assessment is done, you go through to reconciliation and figure out, how do we reconcile these gaps? Or maybe there's some other factors that are going in that need to be taken into account. Somebody's got too much access because they switched from one role to another, but they've got kind of a bleed over period where they're still doing some of their previous responsibilities, so they need access in double cases. Generally speaking, it's not the best idea to do that, but sometimes that's what the business need is, and we're here to support the business. And then, of course, there's always deprovisioning. You know, once the person is done or leaves the organization, you deprovision the account and go from there. And again, this is just a general process. Your life cycle within your organization may vary. So a couple of things to go into when we're looking at these identity processes to kind of add some flesh to some of what I was talking about in the previous one. There's a lot of authorization. You might think, hey, this is simple. Well, you've got employees, and that part is, somewhat simple, but that's going to change a little bit depending on if they're an administrator or not. In a healthy organization, in a well set up identity program, the administrative accounts are separate from their standardized accounts. Part of the reason that's so important is if you have a standardized account, that's what hackers gain access to. In fact, some of the hacking tools that are out there might come over standard email or when you're searching the web or whatever that story is, can actually compromise the system, and they're going to gain the access level of the account that's already logged in. So you'd want a standard employee account to be compromised and not an administrative account, because administrator accounts have a lot more access than standard employee account. Now, there can be a lot of problems still, but that's one of the reasons why we like to separate them from a cybersecurity perspective. But so employees are but one side, but you might have contractors or consultants or vendors that are coming in that are doing things for various reasons. There's a lot of good justification for that, but that gets a little bit more complicated, because where do you get, we'll go into this in a later session, but you need to have a source of truth. Are there people from a contractor perspective giving things from a centralized perspective to figure out who's authorized in the environment? A manager might be aware of it, or maybe they're not aware of it. But this is where you have to really find ways of tracking things. And that authorization gets tricky because you have multiple sources of truth. A single manager in any department might have a contractor, consultant, or vendor in it, depending on the way the company's set up and the size of the company and a lot of other factors. So you start to see how these things get complicated rather quickly. But then you also have service accounts. There's administrative accounts and service accounts. So administrative accounts, we've talked about. The system accounts, though, are pre-built accounts that are in the system. For example, within Windows, there are a lot of system accounts that are built into any system that's there. And a lot of times you need these several layers of system accounts in order to keep the system functioning properly. But then there are service accounts. So let's say if you install an application, you might need an additional account to do some of the management that particular account is going to be doing. So if you connect into a database, there might be an additional account for doing that, having that connectivity. There's a lot of things that can take place. There's the scripts that are running. It's a well-known common problem with service accounts that you're going to find all kinds of problems. A lot of times they have the username and password built into that service account because it's a script that's using to connect into something else. It is far from a best practice, but you can start to see how that authorization comes to place, because then you have IT authorizing itself to be able to create service accounts that are connecting into who knows what. But trying to create and manage the overall process is an important part of that process. But let's jump a little bit towards the provisioning and deprovisioning. One thing to consider is authentication. What type of authentication is appropriate? And the answer is it depends on the organization. Everybody's aware of the username and passwords. We have to log in order to gain access to a lot of things. So all of us are used to some of the basics. Even if you're very young, you probably have encountered multi-factor authentication. So multi-factor authentication is something that you have, something that you know, and something that you are. So from that authentication standpoint, it means that you can't, if you compromise one credential, that's okay. You still need a second method. So if you have something that you have, a password, or that's your password, you might have something that you have, maybe a token of some kind, and something that you are would be a biometric. So if you've got multiple forms of authentication that are required in order to gain access to a system, you provide an additional level of protection for an organization. Single sign-on is another thing that's very useful within a lot of organizations. So single sign-on is where you're able to log into another resource automatically without having to manually put in another username and password and go through an MFA process in order to gain access. And the reason that's so important is, let's say you've got 15 to 20 different systems that you're logging into at any given time. Well, if you have to log into 15 to 20 and the screen share disables after 15 minutes, so that's part of the automatic logout process, and then you've got to log in. You could be logging in 50 to 100 times a day. And so single sign-on can actually be a huge boon for organizations because it's saving everybody that extra time of logging in. People are going to be more productive if you've got SSO in place. So there's a lot of other use cases for SSO, but it is part of the authentication process that should be taken into account. But but it's, one more factor in that provisioning because you want to be able to provision it or deprovision it. When you're talking about SaaS applications, which we'll talk about a little bit later, single sign-on can be a huge help in that particular case too. When you talk about access control models, that's yet another thing to consider. And we're going to talk about those in another presentation, not in today's presentation, because that's incredibly important to consider that. But there's also entitlements. Entitlements are what access should you have access to, and a lot of this is going to be based on roles. Like one access control model is a role-based access control. So if you're in human resources, you might have different access than, say, the marketing team. And this can affect all kinds of different things, but it is part of that process. Then, of course, the enabling and disabling of accounts. There's a lot of processes that can be built around that, but generally speaking, these are the core things from a provisioning standpoint. Then, of course, there's validation. This is part of that assessment process that you go through. When you look at the status, that's kind of one of the big things when you're doing these types of reports. You can have an authorized account, in which case, great, you're good. That account is authorized. We validated it, and we make sure that we're good. An account could be unauthorized. Maybe somebody created an account that nobody was aware of, or maybe somebody created an account like, whoops, my bad, it was me. It's an unauthorized account. It didn't go through the appropriate approval process, but it's sitting on a system. Now, in many organizations, and this is such a common thing within, especially the IT groups, they're going to create an account because they need it temporarily to test something out, to see if something is working properly. And that's part of their overarching process. And those are very helpful in many cases, but are they being deleted? Are you paying attention to it? Are there accounts that have additional access that shouldn't have additional access, and so on? An orphaned account is a little bit different. An orphaned account is something that was valid, but maybe it's no longer in use. So let's say a service account was set up for a particular application. It was used for 5 years, and then that service account was no longer valid anymore. So if it's no longer valid, then it becomes orphaned if you don't handle it in the right way. If you're not disabling it and turning it into an overall process from an identity standpoint, it becomes orphaned. And so that orphaned account can be compromised by a potential hacker that could be used to do something very nefarious within your organization. Now, a rogue account is even more concerning than an orphaned account. Now, a rogue account is created. Nobody knows why it was created, and there's no information. That in that case, you're going to refer to that as a rogue account. That's somebody doing something possibly nasty within your organization. So it's really important to kind of figure out what the status of these are, because it helps you to assess what the risk is and what are the problems. So identity is one of those ways, really taking a look at the processes within an organization and figuring out what's the best way to move forward. Some other identity considerations, shared accounts. Generally speaking, shared accounts are frowned upon. There's always exceptions to that rule, though. If you take anything from an absolute perspective, you can run into problems. Like, for example, you might need a backup administrator account. If you have that backup administrator account, just in case, for whatever reason, nobody can gain access to things, you can go over to that particular system and validate and make sure that it's not compromised. So taking into account some of these exceptions is very important. There might be other business reasons, like some hotels have a kiosk and they don't give you the username and password to log into the individual system. So they just have a kiosk there that anybody can use. And so that's a business reason for doing that. You might want to throw in some additional controls to protect yourself there, but it's one possibility. Now, groups are yet another identity consideration. Especially in the Windows world, you want to tie things into a group. And so a lot of these are around access groups. So they'll help to determine. So you might name it the email access group. So maybe one group of employees is going to have access to email and another will not. It depends on your organization. Both are legitimate possibilities. So they really help the IT team. So if you just attach somebody to a group and like, hey, they have this role, great. So they're going to have these 5 groups. That's going to help identify what that process is going to be for that organization. Well, let's take a step back. Let's take a little bit about the technology context. So there is a lot happening from an identity standpoint, over the last, 20 years. In the old days, we had mainframes. This is like very early on. And they had, in some cases, no username and password, but later on they developed usernames and passwords. And they were added into the overall process. But what you found is you started to develop personal computers, and then eventually we had laptops, IoT devices. This is something we could spend a lot of time talking about. But for those who are not familiar with IoT, who haven't heard some of the previous presentations that I've given, IoT is an Internet of Thing. And Internet of Things are very famous for not having appropriate security. There's something called OWASP IoT Top 10, which talks about a ton of the problems. Some of them will have default passwords that are in there that are very weak. Some of them have built-in passwords. It's what's called hard-coded. So if you have a hard-coded password, you cannot change the password. It depends on the IT systems, and there's a lot to go into from an IoT perspective. But needless to say, it is yet another consideration from an identity standpoint. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in the next slide about why that's so important. But IoT definitely has a lot of considerations. But you also have cloud environments, and we are going to touch on that as well. There's a lot of different cloud accounts that are being used in trying to manage those identities and make sure that you've got the appropriate security related to an account is important. And now there's iPads, there's smartphones, all these other things are part of the computing world that we're dealing with today. When you talk about the connectivity systems that are in the gray below, a lot of those systems also have identities. So your network devices, more speaking to the IT people, but if you have like a firewall at home or something, they're also going to have accounts. So then you have to have a username and password in order to access those accounts to do things. There's a lot of other types of things. You can have, equivalent of passwords for Wi-Fi when you're trying to connect in. So you build that into the overall process. Email systems can have that. Email can also have multi-factor authentication. There's a lot that can go into this. From a basic user standpoint of a typical organization, you're going to put in something called multi-factor authentication. As I said, passwords are stolen all the time in breaches. And so if somebody's reusing a password, this is part of defense in depth. If they reuse a password and they use it there, you don't want an attacker to be able to gain access to your whole organization through a VPN simply because somebody reused a password. So adding multi-factor authentication to a VPN is extraordinarily important. From a developing perspective, there's a lot of other things that are going on here. There's open source software, a lot of websites, Web 2.0, 3.0. The list goes on, but you start to see from an identity standpoint, it's really complex because the technology is complex. So just keep that in the back of your mind as you go through that. And again, these are not meant to be specific, perfect dates. This is to give you a general idea of what the evolution of technology and how it relates to identity in this specific case. So now we're going to move on to IoT. I talked about some of the problems with IoT, but this helps to put it in context. We saw here in 2023, we're getting close to 20 billion devices, whereas the standard computers, laptops, servers, et cetera, we're a little above 10 billion devices, so almost double the number of IoT. So let's stop to think about it though. In your organization, you may have no IoT devices, or you may have far more IoT devices than you do traditional devices. Where and how those systems connect in and what the level of security you can have for an IoT device is incredibly important. And if you've got more IoT devices, and let's say they, for sake of argument, they don't have very good security, well, that means that possibly 2/3 of your devices are places where a hacker can hang out. In many cases, when you're talking about IoT security, you cannot install antivirus on it. There's very few means of being able to protect the system except at a networking level. This means that you've got to use these compensating controls to work around things in order to protect those IoT devices. So SaaS is very interesting as well. And this was pulled in from the CIO device, but you're looking at the average number of apps. So this is SaaS, software as a service. So these are like basic websites that you're logging into to get certain things done. The average security department, 78, engineering, 77. But what's interesting about this is, and what it's trying to point out, there's a lot of SaaS applications, but the average corporation can have up to 453 different SaaS applications. So if that's the case, that's really interesting when you start to take a look at it, because many of those are probably not authorized or owned by the IT department. If they're not authorized and owned by the IT department, are they considered rogue IT? Have you set up your single sign-on? In this case, you can start to understand why single sign-on is so important for organizations. And you have to authorize each group to gain access to the appropriate resources in order to figure out how to handle something like that. So if they are not authorized, though, take something like artificial intelligence. That can be considered a SaaS application in a way, because it's a tool that's being used by the organization. And is it part of rogue IT? But if you haven't trained the users, like, hey, there's some considerations that you need to take into account when it comes to SaaS applications. Are you allowing them access? Can the AI create hallucinations? Can it give you fake information? What happens if you put that information into the SaaS applications? What if you're putting sensitive client information into that SaaS application, and then somebody else sees, oh, this is your company, and it has your name on it, it has your data in there. What are the challenges there? So obviously I'm picking on artificial intelligence in this particular case to illustrate a point. Any type of application that you use on the cloud that's SaaS, that's developing something, and you think, hey, this is just cute, it's simple, we're putting some information up there, there are potential risks. Typically speaking, when you're talking about protecting a SaaS application, it's about these larger order considerations. But how many of these are rogue IT going on within your organization? So this is part of that larger discussion within identity. You've got to learn how to protect it. If you have unprotected apps, what if you have somebody's access, they're putting sensitive data up there and there's no multi-factor authentication, they have poor authentication in general. Let's say they use password 1234 as their password and no uppercase, you've got some serious problems. That data is exposed in another place that you may not be thinking about. So this is definitely important. But in general, this is where we're going to stop today. You can see that there were a lot of slides, but they were very packed, and there's a lot to talk about with each one of these slides related to identity. Identity is such an important part of the security of an organization today, because you've got to think about where is everything located. We've got a lot that we can do. We can help you build, identity programs, assessments, blah, 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 et cetera. If you need help with setting these up, we can run those programs for you. We've got virtual CISO services and so on. This is all part of what we do, but reach out to us. If you have any questions, reach out to me. It's matthew.webster@divergence.biz. You can follow us on YouTube, LinkedIn, X, and so on. And I want to thank you very much for your time today. It's greatly appreciated. Bye-bye.